All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to look past the day-to-day headlines to really understand what's happening in the war in Ukraine. Because as we stand in November 2025, this isn't just one single conflict. Nope, it's a war being fought on multiple fronts, all at the same time. On the ground, in the global economy, and, tragically, for the very future of a whole generation of children. To get the real picture, you have to look at all of these pieces together.
You know, we have to start right here, with this really blunt warning from journalist Sam Tiley. Because the first step to understanding this war is cutting through the fog, the propaganda, the misinformation. What Russia says officially is one thing, the reality on the ground, well, that's something else entirely.
And this is a perfect example of what he's talking about. Take the battle for the town of Pokrovsk. Moscow is out there claiming its forces have Ukrainian troops totally surrounded. But what does the geolocated footage, the stuff we can actually verify, show us? It shows a brutal, street-by-street grinding fight. It's a world away from a clean, simple encirclement.
So let's zoom in on Pokrovsk. This city in the Donetsk region has really become the epicenter of this ground war. It's a microcosm of the whole conflict. You can see the intensity, the tactics, and the staggering human cost all playing out right there.
The details coming from the front line are pretty revealing. Yes, Russian forces are pushing forward on the edges of the city, but it's an incredibly slow, costly advance. And Ukraine isn't just sitting back. They're hitting back with counterattacks, even managing to retake the city council building for a time. But here's the real tell. Russia's trying to resupply its troops with motorcycles and drones. Think about that. That's a huge sign their normal logistics are in deep trouble. This is what a pure war of attrition looks like.
Okay, so seeing that kind of brutal fighting in Pokrovsk begs a much bigger question, right? What is actually fueling Russia's war effort? And maybe more importantly, where are the cracks starting to show? To find that answer, we got to go from the front lines all the way to the factory floors.
And boom, here is a number that just stops you in your tracks. Uralvagonzavod, or UVZ, isn't just a tank factory. It is Russia's only manufacturer of modern tanks. And it's planning to lay off 10% of its workforce. Some departments are apparently looking at cuts as high as 50%. This is a massive, flashing red light that Russia's defense industry is in serious trouble.
So it leads to a pretty obvious question, doesn't it? If your one and only modern tank factory is cutting its staff while you're losing tanks every single day on the battlefield, you've got to change things up. So if not tanks, then what?
And this is where we see the answer. Russia's Ministry of Defense is shifting gears big time. They seem to be deprioritizing tank production to focus on a totally different way of fighting. It's all about drones, massive waves of infantry on foot, and using light, fast vehicles like motorcycles. The era of the big armored push seems to be giving way to a strategy of just overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers on the ground, all while being supported by swarms of drones from the air.
But you know, a huge tactical shift like that doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It is directly tied to the immense economic pressure being applied by the West. And that brings us to the next front, the global economic war. This is a battle of sanctions versus smugglers and shadow fleets. The EU's latest sanctions package, man, this one is trying to hit them everywhere. Sure, it includes a ban on Russian LNG down the road, but the real teeth are in the details. They're targeting the entire ecosystem that helps Russia pay for this war. The shadow fleet of oil tankers, the middlemen in places like China and the UAE, and even their own internal payment systems. And here's why that's so crucial. Evading sanctions, it's like a giant global shell game. Russian oil gets loaded onto one of these shady tankers. It's sold to a trader in a third country. Then it gets refined somewhere like India. And then the final product, like gasoline, can be sold on the open market. And it could even end up back in the very countries that started the sanctions. So going after the ships and the traders is an attempt to break that whole chain. So on one side, you have the West trying to choke off Russia's war money. But on the other side, Ukraine is in its own desperate race against the clock. It's a race driven by a really dangerous drop in foreign aid and a massive, ambitious bet on themselves.
Just look at these numbers from the Kiel Institute. They paint a really worrying picture. In the summer of 2025, the military aid that countries promised to Ukraine dropped by 43% compared to the first half of the year. With US aid stalled, everyone looked to Europe. And then, even that support seemed to dry up.
But, and this is a huge but, look at how Ukraine is responding. It is nothing short of audacious. They're aiming to produce $60 billion worth of weapons a year at home by 2026, and we're not just talking about bullets. They've even signed a deal with Sweden to start producing Gripen fighter jets right there in Ukraine. The message is pretty clear. If foreign help is fading, Ukraine is going all in on itself. Now we have to turn to what is, frankly, the most disturbing front of this entire war. It's one that's often hidden from view, and it goes way beyond battlefields or economics. We're talking about the systematic deportation of Ukrainian children by Russia.
The Institute for the Study of War just lays it out there, plain and simple. Russia claims this is a humanitarian effort, but the ISW says that's not what this is about. This is a cynical strategy to turn children into political pawns, into bargaining chips to be used in negotiations.
And let's be absolutely crystal clear about what this means under international law. The forcible transfer of civilians from a territory you occupy, that's a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. It is a potential crime against humanity, and that is exactly what Russia is being accused of here.
You know, Russia officially claims it has only taken hundreds of children, but their own state media, their own officials, they tell a completely different story. We're talking over 1,000 children just from Mariupol sent to one region, hundreds flown to Moscow on military planes, kids from occupied Zaporizhia getting adopted in another region. This isn't some small-scale thing. It is a vast, systematic campaign that stretches across all of Russia.
So, what happens when you put all of these pieces together? You've got the meat grinder in Pokrovsky, a Russian war machine that's creaking at the seams, a global economic war, Ukraine's desperate race to arm itself, and this horrific war on children. What does it all add up to?
Well, a senior NATO intelligence officer recently gave a pretty sobering assessment. They said this isn't the beginning of the end. It might just be the midpoint of a long war. That suggests we're in for a long, drawn-out struggle, where things like endurance and industrial strength are going to be just as decisive as any victory on the battlefield.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? We see a Russian war machine that's adapting on the fly but is cracking under the strain. We see a defiant Ukraine racing against time to build its own strength as foreign help becomes less certain. So, as another winter of war sets in, the real battle is about endurance. Which side has truly built the resilience to survive whatever comes next? That is the question that will define the future of this war.